Hey, this is Mark with Practical Still. We're going to open up another bottle. This one's kind of cool. George Dickel has released a bourbon. And if you're not much into bourbons and Tennessee whiskeys, you might think, well, gosh, George Dickel makes bourbon all the time. But that's not quite the case. George Dickel makes Tennessee whiskey, which shares an awful lot with bourbon, and in most cases could have been labeled a bourbon all along. The only two big differences between bourbon and Tennessee whiskey are one, that it's made in Tennessee, and two, that it uses what's called the Lincoln County process, where they run the new make spirit through layers and layers of maple charcoal to mellow out that spirit before it goes into the barrel. But that doesn't mean it can't be bourbon. And there's really nothing different as far as I can tell. This is the same 84% corn, 8% malted barley, 8% rye mash bill that all George Dickel whiskey is made of. And in fact, I think it answers the question I've had from the sourcing side. So when a company like Barrel Bourbon or some other non-distiller producer sources whiskey from Dickel and calls it a bourbon, did Dickel produce that whiskey any different? In other words, do they produce some whiskey and not do the Lincoln County process? And some they do, and that becomes Tennessee whiskey. Well, according to the distiller and manager at George Dickel, Nicole Austin, she called these bourbon because they just had the characteristics of bourbon more than they had the characteristics of Tennessee whiskey. And I think that tells us that they distill and treat their whiskey all the same. It just comes down to, what does that whiskey taste like? What are the characteristics of that whiskey? And in this case, she felt like this batch of whiskey tasted more like a bourbon than a traditional Tennessee whiskey, and so we get the benefit of a George Dickel bourbon instead of a Tennessee whiskey. We also get the added benefit of an 8-year age statement, and that's just something that's been coming back a little bit. We lost a lot of age statements in the previous years, and they're starting to come back. Jim Beam's gone back to them. So an 8-year-old whiskey, I paid a little more than this than retail. I think retail's $33, I paid $36, but I was just surprised to see it, so I bought one for Dan too. And I'm really excited to try it. As you know from watching anything Dan and I do, we love Dickel-produced whiskey. Will I be able to tell any difference between this and things that they label as Tennessee whiskey? Well, we're about to find out if I can pull the quite complicated plastic off of this. Oh, and one more thing. You've probably seen for years Dickel that has an 8 on it and a 12 on it. The 8 and the 12, which is kind of the low-end George Dickel Tennessee whiskey, and the next step up, the number 12, those are not age statements. That 8 and that 12 denote recipes, just like the old number 7 on Jack Daniels. Although at Jack Daniels, they tell you they don't know why it's called old number 7. It's because they used to have to give the recipe number or differentiate those in their lineup. It's really funny to call it a recipe because it uses all the same recipe, but the characteristics, the proof, probably the age is all different. The 8 on this bottle, as it says next to it years, is actually an age statement. So the 8 and the 12 on the standard releases, not age statements, just recipes or releases or expressions. This is actually an age statement. Looks like the same bottle the bottle and bond comes in, so a little plastic top and synthetic cork. I'm going to say that nose is a little different. Maybe I'm influenced by the story, but that does nose a little different than the typical George Dickel whiskey. So this is 90 proof. Drinks about 90 proof. It is I don't know if it's just a light mouthfeel, a light body, or if we might say it's delicate or sophisticated. But it's definitely not thick. It's not a thick, coaty whiskey. Well, it tastes good. And at 30 some odd dollars a bottle for an 8-year-old age-dated product, that's a pretty good deal. I gotta say, it doesn't really taste a lot like the typical George Dickel whiskey. Maybe Nicole's right. in that this one has more of a bourbon flavor to it. I think I'd pick up that it was Dickel, but Dan blind tasted me on a sourced whiskey that is rumored to be made by Dickel, but of a different mash bill. If you know it's Dickel, you can tell. I think with this one, maybe that's the case. But it really doesn't have that funky flavor that a lot of Dickel Tennessee whiskey has, which I happen to like a lot. So if I was blind taste this, I don't know that I would have guessed it as a Dickel product. I guess we'll live with that for a while and go back to the bottle down the road. Right off the bat, I'm pretty excited about an 8-year product at $30-something. I wish it had a little thicker mouthfeel to it, but the flavors are delicious, and it does taste more bourbony than Tennessee whiskey. So have you had this 8-year-old George Dickel bourbon yet? Are you excited that George Dickel's making something with bourbon on the label? Does it answer any questions for you like I think it did for me? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. For the moment, at $30-something for an 8-year-old product, I'm pretty happy with it. Cheers.